you're of the kind of person who doesn't want to fully commit to 0.5 milligram oral dutasteride daily, maybe you have side effects on that, but at the same time, you want to kind of push the, envelope a bit more beyond 1 milligram oral finasteride daily, then this sort of middle ground of 0.1 milligram oral dutasteride daily might be something that would be of interest. At the very least, what we can recognize is that a low dose dutasteride might be better than finasteride based on this concept alone. We don't have to, particularly the 0.1 milligram oral dutasteride did slightly better. Hey guys, before we continue this video, I would like to mention that we now have liposomal monoxidil sulfate on my website, folligens.com, folligens.com, and if the order queue is available and open, you can order it there. Go check it out and maybe even try it out. See you there. Hello everyone and welcome back to yet another video. We're going to do things a bit more ad hoc today and we're just going to talk about low dose dutasteride. And we're actually going to Japan because in Japan they have 0.5 milligram oral dutasteride. We already know this. If you're looking at the screen right now, you can see the Avodart GlaxoSmithKline Japanese branded dutasteride, 0.5 milligram, and another brand called Zilago, I believe, Zilago 0.5 milligram oral dutasteride. Now, what makes this special? Why are we talking about oral dutasteride? You can probably get it in your home country. Well, this is a video about low-dose oral dutasteride. Well, let's go over to this webpage. They also have oral dutasteride at 0.1 milligram as a capsule, but also as a tablet as well. There are other compounding pharmacies, as it seems, in Japan that they do capsules and tablets at 0.1 milligrams. That's pretty cool, and that's of our interest. If you're of the kind of person who doesn't want to fully commit to 0.5 milligram oral dutasteride daily, maybe you have side effects on that, but at the same time, you want to kind of push the, envelope a bit more beyond 1 milligram oral finasteride daily, then this sort of middle ground of 0.1 milligram oral dutasteride daily might be something that would be of interest. So you're probably wondering, why might a person want to use dutasteride? Well, let's have a look at this study, and we're going to learn a concept here. The title of the study is, quote, Marked Suppression of Dihydrotestosterone in Men with Benign Prostatic Hyperplasia by Dutasteride, a Dual 5-alpha-reductase Inhibitor, unquote. And in one of the paragraphs, we're introduced to this specific line. We find out that the IC50 for the type 1 5-alpha-reductase enzyme for dutasteride is 0.7 nanomolar versus finasteride's 81 nanomolar. And again, I'll explain what this means shortly. For the type 2 5-alpha-reductase enzyme, it is, get this, 0.05 nanomolar for dutasteride versus finasteride's 0.16 nanomolar. So what does this mean? Well, in order to know what this means, we have to figure out, what does IC50 mean? IC50 means the amount of a drug needed to block 50% of a target. Whatever that target is, in this case, it'll be the 5-alpha-reductase enzyme, and it can either be type 1 or type 2. So just keep that in mind. That's the target we're going for. So how much of the drug do we need to block something? Now think about this intuitively. If you need less of a drug to block 50% of your target, that means that drug is pretty potent. But if you need more of a drug to block 50% of that same target, comparatively between the two drugs, drug A and drug B, that means, in this case, the drug that you need more of, drug B, that means it is less potent. So let's put this into a context we can understand. Let's assume that drug A is dutasteride, and as we've learned from the other study, for type 2 5-alpha-reductase suppression, it is 0.05 nanomolar. You don't need to know what a nanomolar is, just know that it is a very small unit for a particular chemical compound. So we need 0.05 nanomolar to suppress 50% of the type 2 5-alpha-reductase enzyme. Whereas over here, it says we need 0.16 nanomolar to suppress the type 2 5-alpha-reductase enzyme, 50% of it, for finasteride. So if we put this into a context we can understand, over here under high potency, ignore the measurements on the bottom, just keep this conceptually. For high potency, that means dutasteride is more potent than finasteride because you need less of the drug to suppress half of the target, being the type 2 5-alpha-reductase enzyme. Another point to take into account is that you can clearly look at the IC50 scores and notice something. So for both type 1 and type 2, dutasteride is actually suppressing more of that 5-alpha reductase enzyme. So if you're somebody that has sensitive scalp when it comes to DHT and you're really, really sensitive to that hormone, that means if you use dutasteride, you might get better results. Of course, as you go up in 5-alpha reductase suppression, your DHT will fall and your testosterone will elevate, and you might get a degree of hormonal fluctuation, and that can cause side effects. If you have too much testosterone, that can also cause sexual side effects. If you have too little testosterone, it can cause sexual side effects. If you have too much estrogen, that can also cause sexual side effects as well. So if you're kind of pushing the envelope in that dynamic, some people are a bit more sensitive than others. So this video is for people who are a bit more sensitive when it comes to 5-alpha reductase inhibitors, but they still want to do better than finasteride. And again, once more, as I've stated in the beginning, not fully commit to the 0.5 milligram dutasteride every day. So at the very least, what we can recognize is that a low dose dutasteride might be better than finasteride based on this concept alone. We don't have to commit to 0.5 milligram dutasteride if we can simply get away with using 0.1 milligram oral dutasteride. Now, let me just say this. 0.5 milligram dutasteride is well studied. So if you're somebody that's doing well on 0.5 milligram dutasteride, don't play with your dose. Don't mess around with it because you could just end up destabilizing your hair follicles for no reason. Once more, this is for people who get side effects on 0.5 milligram dutasteride. They probably don't get any on the typical 1 milligram finasteride dose, but they still want to get a bit more of that scalp DHT suppression. So hopefully this segment makes sense and now you understand IC50, but also you understand the utility of dutasteride in general. So now in this next segment, we can look at a particular study that helped inform Japan's Pharmaceuticals and Medical Devices Agency, that is their version of the FDA, titled, quote, a randomized, active, and placebo-controlled study of the efficacy and safety of different doses of dutasteride versus placebo and finasteride in the treatment of male subjects with androgenetic alopecia, unquote. Now, this was a very large randomized study, so you have a trial that is doing different doses at 0.02 milligram, 0.1 milligram, and 0.5 milligram per day of dutasteride. So they're in different groups, right? Different groups, different doses. Then you have finasteride 1 milligram per day, and then you have the placebo, which is nothing. And this trial went on for about 6 months or 24 weeks. So let's go to the results section real quick and read it. It says, quote, in total, 917 men were randomized. Hair count and hair width increased dose dependently with dutasteride. Dutasteride 0.5 milligrams significantly increased hair count and width in a 2.54 centimeter diameter and improved hair growth. Frontal view plane photographic assessment at week 24 compared with finasteride and placebo. So it shows that dutasteride has a dose-dependent response in terms of how it increased hair. And we know this from other studies like the Olsen et al. 2006 study. This study over here titled, quote, the importance of dual 5-alpha reductase inhibition in the treatment of male pattern hair loss, results of a randomized placebo-controlled study of dutasteride versus finasteride, unquote. We know that there's a dose-dependent nature, even beyond 0.5 milligram. So in this study, we looked at, for the Olsen et al. Study that is, we looked at 0.05, 0.1, 0.5, and 2.5 milligram of oral dutasteride, and we kind of saw something similar in terms of hair count, right? We can see in this section in the Olsen et al. Paper that the change from baseline in hair count was dose-dependent. At 0.05, you can see compared to placebo, it was doing better. Both fin and dutasteride did better than placebo. But compared between the dutasteride groups, you can see it's like a gradation, right? You're going from least hair count with 0.05 all the way up to the biggest improvement in hair count from the baseline being 2.5 milligram per day, right? Compared to finasteride, which is, doing better actually than 0.05 dutasteride, but it's not doing better than 0.1 milligram oral dutasteride. Pretty interesting. It does slightly improve, right? It might as well be kind of the same sort of improvement if you're looking at it visually, but finasteride's not doing any better than 0.5 milligram oral dutasteride. It's not doing better than 2.5 milligram oral dutasteride. So we can kind of say that 0.1 milligram oral dutasteride is a bit better than 1 milligram or even 5 milligram oral finasteride, because 5 milligram and 1 milligram oral finasteride don't really have much of a difference. I'm not going to go through the other studies, but there are other studies that show that they don't really have much of a difference when it comes to tissue suppression of DHT and serum suppression of DHT. So they're pretty much equivalent. There is no dose-dependent response beyond 1 milligram finasteride. So that's pretty interesting. Kind of a similarity we can note between the Olsen et al. Paper and the other paper we can see here from Harcha et al. If we go all the way over here in this particular paper that informed the 0.1 milligram approval of dutasteride, we can see that, yes, once again, there is a dose-dependent response in terms of improvement to hair count. Particularly, the 0.1 milligram oral dutasteride did slightly better than the 1 milligram oral finasteride. And the 0.5 milligram oral dutasteride did better than the 1 milligram oral finasteride, the 0.1 milligram oral dutasteride, and the 0.02 oral dutasteride. But even then, the 0.02 oral dutasteride did better than placebo, but you can see that, there was a bit of a decline in hair count from week 12 to week 24. So it does provide some protection, but that protection wanes over time. So it's inferior compared to finasteride at 1 milligram. So anyone that's saying like low dose, super micro dosing of dutasteride is helpful, yeah, maybe to an extent, but it's not going to be that helpful long term. But 0.1 milligram oral dutasteride looks very practical. But keep in mind, this is only with a 2.54 centimeter diameter, within that 2.54 centimeter diameter, so it's a bigger scope. But this study does a good thing because they even shrink the scope to try to get an even, I guess you can say, magnified hair count in a particular area. And from that, you can see that still that sort of dose-dependent response with dutasteride tracks pretty well, right? And it does appear to be the case that the 0.1 milligram oral dutasteride, once again, beats the 1 milligram oral finasteride. So it's no wonder why Japan said, okay, this is a good dose. People can, they don't have to commit to the full dutasteride 0.5 milligram dose, but they can still get a reasonable suppression and improvement in hair count by using the least amount possible, which is pretty cool. So 0.1 milligram oral dutasteride looks like it's better than 1 milligram oral finasteride. If we go back to the Olsen et al. Paper, they have a pretty cool graph over here. The mean change in hair count compared to scalp DHT. The 0.1 milligram oral dutasteride is performing, about the same, actually, in terms of scalp DHT suppression. Maybe a bit less from what we can see here. I think in this study they used 5 milligram oral finasteride. So you're looking at a 35% reduction in scalp DHT. And it looks like 0.1 milligram falls slightly behind, if not maybe on the same amount of suppression of scalp DHT from what we can quantify. But in terms of hair count, it's elevated above, slightly elevated above. So it looks like it's slightly improving hair count, but we don't have to speculate too much. All we can see is that the two seem to be in close parity. But when you take both of the studies into account, what you can note is that 0.1 milligram dutasteride may slightly beat out 1 milligram oral finasteride. So that's a bit of a good takeaway point. Another paper that I think it's worth mentioning, I talked about this before in my channel, but it's this study over here titled, quote, Efficacy and Safety of Twice or Thrice-Weekly Dutasteride versus Daily Finasteride in Men with Androgenetic Alopecia, a randomized investigator-blinded, active, controlled, parallel group pilot study, unquote. And the conclusions of this study noted that twice-weekly and thrice-weekly, being 3 times a week, regimens of dutasteride increased hair growth and were well tolerated. Although thrice-weekly dutasteride was significantly superior to twice-weekly dutasteride in terms of hair density and diameter, thrice-weekly dutasteride did not significantly increase hair count over finasteride 1 milligram daily. So what is that saying? If you take a 0.5 milligram dutasteride capsule twice a week or 3 times a week, you're still going to get an improvement in hair count. But for the 3 times a week at 0.5 milligram dutasteride versus the 1 milligram finasteride daily, they're kind of going to be about the same. And if I'm not mistaken, 0.1 milligram oral dutasteride kind of comes out, I think, at 3 times a week, or maybe rather 2 times a week, somewhere between those two of 0.5 milligram dutasteride at those frequencies. All I'm trying to show you here is that the lower dose of oral dutasteride is still an option for some people. Maybe switching to 0.1 milligram or introducing that into your stack as you have the 1 milligram oral finasteride can help you. It can help you if you don't want to commit to the full-on dose of the 0.5 milligram dutasteride daily. So in this document over here, This is Japan's FDA approval file for dutasteride for male pattern hair loss. More specifically, it's a regulatory review report written by Japan's drug authority under the Ministry of Health. And it's going to explain why dutasteride was approved and at what doses and at what safety and efficacy evidence was used to come to this approval. And we're looking at the brand over here called Zagalo capsules. Zagalo capsules at 0.1 milligram, Zagalo capsules at 0.5 milligram. And it's kind of like what I showed you in the beginning, right? This particular brand on top, the ZA one. If I can show you over here once more, this is how the pill looks like. And this is another brand or another compounding pharmacy that makes tablets. But let's go back to what we were looking at, the document. You can essentially think of it as like a scientific summation of the clinical justification for letting doctors prescribe dutasteride for androgenetic alopecia in Japan. And it's a summary of a bunch of studies. So when we look at the summary of approval over here under the dosage and administration, they actually say this, quote, "The usual dosage for adult men is 0.1 milligram of dutasteride administered orally once daily. The dose may be increased to 0.5 milligram orally once daily as necessary," unquote. So it seems to be the case in Japan that when they go for an assessment for androgenetic alopecia, and should the doctor say that dutasteride is good for the patient, their immediate dose that they use is 0.1 milligram of dutasteride orally, which is pretty interesting. But they do note that if anything should happen, if it's not as effective, that can be increased to 0.5 milligram of dutasteride orally once daily. So that's a pretty good treatment plan that I guess doctors in Japan often use. And I found this website over here called AGA CE Medical Office. I think it's probably some sort of clinic in Japan. But you can see over here, they have the capsules we're talking about, the 0.1 milligram Zagalo, whatever it's called, oral dutasteride. And they also have oral minoxidil here too, but it looks like it's at 10 milligrams. So maybe, people have to cut it in half rather than taking the full dose. But, I'd wager to think that there are some people that take the full dose of oral minoxidil at 10 milligram, which can have some pretty nasty side effects. So be careful. But really, in conclusion, 0.1 milligram oral dutasteride might be an option for people who are getting good results on 1 milligram oral finasteride daily, who don't want to commit to 0.5 milligram oral dutasteride, and may want to see if they can get more, of an improvement in their hair count. So all in all, 0.1 milligram oral dutasteride might be for some people who don't want to commit to the 0.5 milligram oral dutasteride, but who are currently on 1 milligram oral finasteride, who are getting some results, but they kind of want to see if they can get a bit more, right? People who are hair hungry, but side effect averse. This could be that happy middle ground. So it's something that I think, people can look into. I know that some countries have a 3-month personal medicines law, so you can talk to your doctor, get a prescription, and potentially even order this from a good pharmacy in Japan who can compound it for you or just probably sell you the typical Zagalo capsules. So that's pretty much it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope to see you in the next one, and hopefully this ad hoc video was easy to follow. I'll try to cut it up and make it more succinct in certain areas. But anyway, I started a company called Folligens. That's Folligenz. You can visit us on folligens.com. Right now, we're selling liposomal monoxidil sulfate. We're pushing it as a cosmetic. At the time of recording this video on February 12th, 2026, we're currently out of stock. We're out of stock. We had a successful run, so thank you for everyone that bought it. But if you enter your name here into the form or onto our mailing list, you'll be able to get a notification when we go back in stock, and you can check it out or maybe even try it out. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Peace out.